Wedged between two of the largest population centers on Earth, Nepal was never supposed to be genetically simple. To the south lies the Indian subcontinent, home to well over 1 billion people. To the north lies the Tibetan Plateau and the vast genetic world of East Asia. And in between sits a wall of rock and ice higher than anywhere else on the planet. For decades, the assumption was straightforward. Nepal, sitting at the base of the Himalayas, must have been peopled from the south, an extension of the Indian subcontinent that slowly crept upward into the foothills. Then, scientists started pulling DNA out of mummified bodies sealed inside cliffside caves nearly 3,000 years old, and the story fell apart. The first people to conquer the high Himalaya did not climb up from India at all. They came down from the north, out of the Tibetan Plateau, carrying inside their cells a genetic gift from a hominin species that vanished tens of thousands of years earlier, and that was only the beginning. Beneath the modern nation of Nepal lies a genetic record showing not one migration, but layer after layer of them, some isolated for millennia, others mixing so recently that scientists can date it almost to the century. This is what the DNA revealed. To understand why Nepal's genetic story turned out to be so strange, you have to understand the geography first. The Himalayan arc is not a single ridge. It is a nearly continuous barrier stretching more than 2,000 kilometers, punctuated by a handful of high mountain valleys sitting above 3,000 meters, thin on oxygen, thin on rainfall, and until relatively recently in human history, essentially uninhabited. Unlike the gentle river valleys that carried farmers and migrants across most of Eurasia, the high valleys of the Himalayan arc were among the last habitable places on Earth to be settled by humans. The cold, the altitude sickness, and the sheer physical difficulty of the terrain meant that for most of human history, this corridor stayed empty while civilizations rose and fell on both sides of it. But Nepal is not uniform. The lowland Terai region bordering India sits at ordinary altitude and always stayed connected to South Asian populations. The Kathmandu Valley sits in the middle, a crossroads in its own right. And then further north, the high valleys near Mustang and the Tibetan border sit in a different genetic world entirely, one shaped far more by the plateau above than the plains below. Nepal, it turns out, is not one genetic story, it is at least 3, stacked on top of each other by elevation. The breakthrough came from one of the strangest archaeological sites in Asia. Scattered across the cliff faces of Nepal's Mustang district are roughly 10,000 hand-carved caves dug directly into vertical rock walls hundreds of feet above the valley floor, accessible only to expert climbers. Locals call them sky caves. Inside, archaeologists found something remarkable. Partially mummified human bodies and skeletons, along with intact silk fabric, bronze jewelry, and bamboo baskets still full of rice, undisturbed for thousands of years. The dry cold of the high Himalaya had done what desert heat does in Egypt. It had preserved not just bone, but soft tissue, and inside that tissue, genetic material that should have degraded long ago. The first known settlers of this region arrived a little more than 3,000 years ago, and where those first people came from had long been a matter of archaeological debate, since some cultural similarities suggested a southern origin from the Indian subcontinent. A team led by geneticist Christina Warrener set out to test that assumption directly, sequencing whole genomes from bodies recovered at the Mustang site. One sample stood out immediately. A 3,000-year-old tooth from the site of Chokopani yielded the highest coverage ancient East Asian human genome recovered anywhere up to that point. The genetic story locked inside that single tooth was about to overturn a century of assumptions about who first conquered the roof of the world. The results, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, were unambiguous.
Despite archaeological hints of a southern origin, the ancient DNA showed that the first inhabitants of the high Himalaya came down from the north, from East Asian populations rooted on the Tibetan Plateau, and their genetic profile closely resembled that of modern-day Sherpa and Tibetan populations. This was a direct contradiction of the old assumption. It was not South Asian farmers pushing upward into the mountains that founded these high valley communities. It was Tibetan plateau populations pushing downward and outward, establishing permanent settlements in some of the harshest inhabited terrain on the planet nearly 3,000 years ago. The researchers described this as a pattern of long-term genetic stability and a high-altitude East Asian origin for the peoples of the high valleys, stretching across the entire Himalayan arc, from Arunachal Pradesh in the east to Ladakh in the west.
What made this even more striking was what happened next, or rather what did not happen. Once these high-altitude populations established themselves, they largely stayed put, genetically speaking, for thousands of years. While empires rose and fell in the lowlands on either side, the small, isolated communities scattered across Nepal's highest valleys held on to a genetic signature that traced directly back to their Tibetan plateau founders. Isolation, driven by nothing more than altitude and geography, had frozen a piece of deep history in place, high above the reach of most of the migrations reshaping the rest of Asia. But surviving in that environment required more than arriving there. It required a body capable of functioning with a fraction of the oxygen available at sea level. And when geneticists went looking for the source of that ability, they found something that connected Nepal's high-altitude peoples to one of the strangest chapters in all of human evolution. Deep inside a gene called EPS1, which regulates how the body responds to low oxygen, Tibetan and Sherpa populations carry a distinctive stretch of DNA. This advantageous haplotype shares an unusually close relationship with the genome of the Denisovans, an extinct branch of archaic humans known mainly from a handful of fossils in a Siberian cave, with the ancient split between the Tibetan and Denisovan versions of this gene dating back roughly 1 million years. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of today's Tibetan and Sherpa populations interbred with Denisovans, and this single stretch of borrowed DNA turned out to be extraordinarily useful. Researchers found that this archaic haplotype is present not just on the Tibetan Plateau, but widely across Bhutan, Nepal, and the surrounding Himalaya, with its frequency strongly correlated with the altitude at which a population lives. The higher the village, the more likely its residents carried the ancient gift. It is quite literally a piece of an extinct human species still functioning inside the bodies of Sherpa mountaineers today, an inheritance that let people live and reproduce in an environment that would otherwise be lethal to sustained settlement. While the high valleys near Mustang preserved a nearly unbroken line back to the Tibetan Plateau, the Kathmandu Valley, sitting at a far more livable altitude in the middle of the country, absorbed a completely different genetic history. This is where farmers, traders, and empires from the Indian subcontinent could actually reach on a regular basis, and the DNA shows it. A genome-wide study of Nepalese populations found a Northeast Asian origin for the broader Himalayan populations, but with subsequent gene flow from South Asia, specifically into the Kathmandu Valley and its indigenous Newar population. In other words, the deep ancestral roots trace north, toward Tibet and East Asia, but that ancestry was substantially reshaped by South Asian populations moving up into the valley in more recent history. A separate study tracing maternal DNA lineages sharpened this picture further, finding that the populations living immediately south of the high Himalaya, particularly the Newar and Magar communities, showed a distinct population history from the high-altitude Sherpa and Tibetan groups, with ancestry that traced back to a Neolithic migration out of East Asia roughly 8,000 years ago, long predating the more recent South Asian influence layered on top of it.
The Kathmandu Valley, in other words, was never as isolated as the high mountain communities above it. It sat exactly where its geography suggested it would, as a genuine meeting point between two of Asia's largest population systems. Perhaps the most surprising discovery involved not the isolated highlanders or the mixed valley populations, but the communities in between, the Tibeto-Burman-speaking groups such as the Tamang, who live at moderate elevations across Nepal. Linguists had long assumed that because these groups spoke languages related to Tibetan, their East Asian ancestry must have come the same way the Sherpas did, directly down from the Tibetan Plateau. The genetic data said otherwise. Researchers studying the genomic landscape of Nepalese Tibeto-Burman populations found that groups like the Tamang derived their East Asian ancestry not from the Tibetan or Sherpa lineage at all, but from low-altitude ancestors who migrated from China, plausibly traveling across northern India or Myanmar, an entirely separate route into the country that had nothing to do with crossing the high plateau.
This meant Nepal had received East Asian ancestry not once, but at least twice, through two geographically distinct corridors that never mixed with each other. The high-altitude specific genetic component tied to the Denisovan-derived adaptations remained restricted almost entirely to the Tibetan and Sherpa populations, who actually lived at extreme elevation, while other Tibeto-Burman communities picked up their East Asian ancestry through a completely different, low-altitude migration route. Speaking a related language, it turned out, said almost nothing about which door your ancestors actually walked through to get there. Recent research has only added more resolution to this layered picture. Just north of Nepal's border in the Ladakh region, scientists sequencing 10 individuals from a site called Old Lady Spider Cave, dated to roughly 1,500 years ago, found a population that was genetically homogeneous but carried an ancestry signature rare among South Asians today, admixed in roughly equal proportions between a population resembling present-day North Indians and one genetically similar to ancient Tibetans. Crucially, that admixture event itself was even older, having arisen at least 1,300 years before the individuals in the cave were even born. A broader 2025 study extended this timeline further, resequencing the original 3,370-year-old Mustang genome from Nepal, alongside newly sequenced individuals from across the northern Himalayan frontier. The researchers found genetic continuity across the region spanning at least the past 1,300 years, alongside layered ancestries connecting these communities to the Tibetan Plateau, the Central Asian steppe, and lowland South Asia, a pattern the researchers noted is consistent with the broader archaeological record. Taken together, these studies describe a region that was never one migration or one people, but an accumulation of distinct genetic events stacked by both altitude and time, some fusing quickly into stable populations that held steady for over a millennium, others staying separate for thousands of years, despite living only a few valleys apart. None of this fully settles the question of Nepal's genetic origins, and researchers are careful to say so. The Mustang genome that anchors much of this story comes from a single archaeological site, and while it has now been resequenced to higher quality, entire regions of Nepal, particularly its eastern hill districts and far western valleys, remain almost completely unsampled in the ancient DNA record. The question of exactly when and how South Asian ancestry moved into the Kathmandu Valley also remains only loosely dated, based on modern population comparisons rather than ancient genomes recovered from the valley floor itself. And the low-altitude East Asian migration route that shaped groups like the Tamang, plausibly crossing through Myanmar or northeastern India, has yet to be confirmed with ancient DNA from any intermediate site along that path. Researchers studying the wider Tibeto-Burman world have called this an open debate regarding the most plausible source of East Asian ancestry in Nepal's lower altitude populations, one that current sampling still cannot fully resolve. What is well supported is the overall shape of the story, multiple independent waves arriving from different directions, filtered and separated by an unforgiving landscape that lets some populations mix freely while keeping others apart for thousands of years, all within the borders of a single, relatively small country. Nepal's genetic history turns out to be less like a single river and more like the terrain itself, a series of separate valleys, each with its own current, occasionally spilling into one another and occasionally staying isolated for millennia.
The high sky cave communities of Mustang trace back to the Tibetan Plateau and carry, quite literally, a fragment of an extinct human species in their DNA, a Denisovan gene that let them breathe where almost no one else on Earth could survive. The Kathmandu Valley absorbed centuries of South Asian gene flow, and the mid-altitude Tibeto-Burman communities scattered across the hills arrived by an entirely separate road, one that had nothing to do with the mountains at all. None of these populations were cut off from humanity. They farmed, they traded silk and bronze, they built permanent settlements in places most of the world still considered unlivable. But they did it in a landscape that sorted people by elevation as much as by geography, preserving some lineages in near-perfect isolation while letting others blend freely in the valleys below. The DNA did not just answer where the Nepali people came from, it revealed that there was never a single answer to begin with. Let us know in the comments which hidden genetic story from the world's mountain regions we should uncover next.